Iran is now charging $2 million per ship to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Bloomberg reported that vessels wanting to transit the most important energy choke point on Earth are being required to register with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, divert from the international shipping lanes, navigate near Iranian islands, provide detailed information on crew and cargo to IRGC intermediaries, and pay transit fees in Chinese yuan or cryptocurrency before being escorted through the waterway. $2 million per ship, in yuan, or crypto, paid to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which the United States designates as a terrorist organization, and the Iranian parliament is now planning to pass a law that ships from hostile nations cannot pass the strait at all, and all others must pay tolls. Mohammad Reza Kouchi, head of the Iranian parliament's construction committee, announced that legislation on April 19th. That is not a temporary wartime measure. That is a permanent structural change to the global energy system. And what it means for every American family who drives a car, heats a home, buys groceries, or pays an electric bill is that the cost of the energy that powers every aspect of their daily life has just been repriced by a country that planted mines in an international waterway, lost track of where it put them, charged $2 million per ship in the currency of America's largest economic competitor, and is now attempting to pass a law making this arrangement permanent. And the 2-week ceasefire that was supposed to stop this expires tomorrow, April 21st, and there is no replacement agreement. The Islamabad talks failed on April 12th. The U.S. declared a naval blockade on April 13th. Iran's IRGC threatened to quote one to any military vessel approaching the strait, and 230 loaded oil tankers remain stranded inside the Persian Gulf as of this week, with 170 million barrels of oil sitting in ships that cannot move. That oil was supposed to heat your home, power your grid, fuel the trucks that deliver your food. And it is floating in the Gulf of Oman right now because Iran has turned the most important shipping lane in the history of global energy into a toll booth operated by the Revolutionary Guard. Iran planted mines in the strait and then lost track of where it put them, and now nobody can safely reopen it. According to reporting that has emerged in the past 2 weeks, Iran planted sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz as part of its closure of the waterway following the U.S.-Israeli airstrikes of February 28th. And according to at least one report cited by multiple outlets, Iran subsequently lost track of where it placed those mines, which means that even if Iran wanted to fully reopen the strait tomorrow, it may be physically unable to do so safely because it does not know where its own mines are. The U.S. Navy has begun mine-clearing operations in the strait as part of the naval blockade declared on April 13th. Mine clearance in a contested waterway is one of the most dangerous and time-consuming military operations that exists. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, with shipping lanes that are only 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. The navigable channels are shallow, constrained, and bordered by Iranian territorial waters on one side and Omani waters on the other. Clearing mines from this waterway while Iran's IRGC Navy maintains a shoot-on-sight policy for unauthorized vessels, and while 230 loaded supertankers are anchored in the vicinity, is an operation with a margin of error that approaches zero. And every day that the mines remain in the water is a day that commercial shipping cannot resume normal operations. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the strait have gone from 0.125% to between 0.2 and 0.4% of the ship's insured value per transit. For a very large crude carrier, that increase alone adds approximately $250,000 per transit, and that was the premium before the mines were laid. After the mine reports emerged, multiple insurers pulled coverage for strait transits entirely. When the insurance industry refuses to cover a shipping route, the route is effectively closed regardless of what the military situation looks like, because no ship owner will send a vessel through an uninsured waterway. The insurance market has made a judgment about the Strait of Hormuz that is independent of the ceasefire, independent of the diplomacy, and independent of the mine-clearing operations. The judgment is that the risk is unacceptable at any commercially viable premium. And that judgment will persist long after the fighting stops because the insurance industry prices risk based on demonstrated vulnerability, and the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz has been demonstrated in the most dramatic possible way. Every barrel of oil that eventually passes through that waterway in the future will carry a permanent risk premium that did not exist before February 28, 2026. And that risk premium will be embedded in the price of every gallon of gasoline, every cubic foot of natural gas, every kilowatt of electricity, and every product that touches energy at any point in its production or distribution for years. Not months, years. And here's what the insurance math actually looks like for American consumers. Before the war, shipping a very large crude carrier through the Strait of Hormuz cost approximately $30,000 to $50,000 in insurance per transit. After the mines were laid and tankers were struck, the war risk premium alone jumped to $250,000 per transit. And for vessels from nations that Iran considers hostile, insurance became unavailable at any price. Lloyd's of London, the world's largest insurance marketplace, has effectively blacklisted the route for standard commercial underwriting. When Lloyd's blacklists a route, it does not gradually recover. The 2019 tanker attacks in the Gulf of Oman, which were comparatively minor, resulted in elevated insurance premiums that lasted for over 18 months after the incident. The 2026 crisis is orders of magnitude worse. Mine placement, tanker strikes, infrastructure attacks, facility destruction, and a full closure of the waterway for weeks will produce insurance repricing that persists for 3 to 5 years minimum. And every dollar of elevated insurance premium is passed through the supply chain to the end consumer. On a supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of oil, a $250,000 insurance surcharge translates to roughly 12.5 cents per barrel. Multiply that across the 21 million barrels per day that normally transit the strait, and you are looking at approximately $2.6 million per day in insurance costs alone that did not exist before February 28th. That is nearly $1 billion per year in incremental insurance costs on a single shipping route, costs that will be absorbed by refineries, distributors, and ultimately the American consumer for years after the last mine is cleared. And the clearing itself will take months because the strait is shallow, the shipping lanes are narrow, and mine clearance in contested waters requires painstaking, dangerous, inch-by-inch sonar sweeps, followed by controlled detonations that temporarily close the lanes being cleared. The U.S. Navy's mine countermeasure fleet is designed for this mission, but the operational reality of clearing a waterway this size under these conditions with an adversary that has declared approach a ceasefire violation is measured in months of sustained effort, not weeks. The fertilizer crisis is already here, and most Americans do not understand that their food supply runs through the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately one-third of global fertilizer trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Nitrogen fertilizer prices have risen 30 to 40% since the strait was closed. And the spring planting season in the Northern Hemisphere, the most critical planting window of the year for American and European agriculture, was already underway when the disruption began. Iran agreed to a request by the United Nations on March 27th to allow humanitarian and fertilizer shipments through the strait to address the disruption during the spring planting season, but that agreement, like everything else associated with the ceasefire, has been inconsistently implemented. The practical effect on American agriculture is that the fertilizer that farmers need to apply to their fields in April and May is either unavailable, delayed, or 30 to 40% more expensive than it was in January. And fertilizer is not a discretionary input. It is a prerequisite for yield. Without adequate nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium applied at the right time in the growing cycle, crop yields decline by 20 to 50% depending on the crop and the soil conditions. American corn, soybean, and wheat production depends on massive volumes of fertilizer applied during a narrow spring window. If the fertilizer arrives late or arrives at a price that makes application economically unviable for farmers operating on thin margins, the yield reduction will show up in the harvest. And the harvest determines the price of every food product that uses corn, soybeans, or wheat as an input, which is virtually every processed food product in the American grocery store. The price of corn determines the price of chicken, pork, beef, and dairy because livestock feed is corn-based. The price of soybeans determines the price of cooking oil, animal feed supplements, and a range of processed food ingredients. The price of wheat determines the price of bread, pasta, cereal, and baked goods. A 30 to 40% increase in fertilizer cost does not produce a 30 to 40% increase in food prices at the grocery store. It produces a 5 to 15% increase that arrives 4 to 8 months after the fertilizer shock, which means the American consumer will see the food price impact of the Strait of Hormuz closure not in April, but in August, September, and October, just before the midterm election. And by then, the connection between Iran's closure of the strait and the price of chicken at the grocery store will be invisible to most Americans because the media cycle will have moved on to the next crisis. But the causal chain is direct, documented, and inescapable. Iran closed the strait. Fertilizer shipments were disrupted. Fertilizer prices rose 30 to 40%. Spring planting was affected. Crop yields will decline. Harvest prices will rise. Food prices will follow, and the American family that is already spending $1,100 per month on groceries will spend $1,200 to $1,250 by fall. Not because of a drought, not because of a disease outbreak, because a country 7,000 miles away mined a waterway that most Americans could not identify on a map. The damage to Qatar and the Gulf states has knocked out 17% of global LNG exports and helium for semiconductors. On March 18th, an attack damaged Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG facility, taking offline approximately 17% of Qatar's natural gas export capacity. Qatar is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. The Ras Laffan complex is one of the largest industrial facilities on Earth, and 17% of its capacity being knocked offline is not a rounding error in global energy markets. It is a structural reduction in the availability of natural gas for heating, electricity generation, and industrial feedstock across Europe and Asia. Global LNG supply has fallen approximately 20% since the crisis began, and Qatar's helium exports, which are critical for semiconductor manufacturing, remain blocked. Helium is used in the cooling systems of the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that produce the most advanced computer chips. Without helium, those machines cannot operate. And without those chips, the production of everything from smartphones to automobiles to medical devices to military equipment is impaired. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain collectively shut in an estimated 7.5 million barrels per day of oil production in March, rising to an estimated 9.1 million barrels per day in April due to storage constraints and infrastructure damage. Those countries physically cannot sell their oil because the only route to open water is through the Strait of Hormuz, and the strait is controlled by Iran. The Gulf states have had to shut down approximately 12 million barrels per day in crude production because there is no viable way around the strait for most of their oil. Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline that can bypass the strait through the Red Sea, but its capacity is limited to approximately 5 million barrels per day, and it cannot accommodate the full volume of Saudi production, let alone production from the other Gulf states. The World Bank estimates the economies of Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq could contract by between 5 and 9% this year as a result. And while those contractions might sound like someone else's problem, they translate directly into the American economy through the energy and commodity channels. Every barrel of Gulf oil that does not reach the global market is a barrel that American refineries cannot process into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Every cubic meter of Qatari LNG that does not reach European terminals is a cubic meter of natural gas that Europe sources from alternative markets, including markets that the United States also depends on, which pushes American natural gas prices higher through competition for a diminished global supply. The Gulf crisis is not a regional event. It is a global supply subtraction that reduces the available energy for every country on Earth simultaneously, and the countries with the highest energy consumption per capita, which includes the United States, absorb the largest share of the price impact. And there is a secondary consequence of the Gulf production shutdown that is even more alarming than the price impact. When oil wells are shut in for extended periods, particularly in the sandstone and carbonate reservoirs that dominate Gulf production, permanent damage can occur. Pressure depletion, wax deposition, water encroachment, and mechanical failures all threaten wells that are suspended abruptly. The IEA specifically warned that some fields may require specialized oil field services, including workovers, coiled tubing units, chemical treatments, and perforation to restart, and that fields relying on enhanced oil recovery could face the longest restart times because they depend on uninterrupted supplies of gas, power, steam, and chemicals that were themselves disrupted. The damage is self-reinforcing. Damaged refineries cannot produce the chemicals needed to restart damaged wells, and damaged wells cannot produce the oil needed to fuel the damaged refineries. The IEA estimated it could take up to 2 years to restore output to pre-war levels. 2 years of constrained global oil supply, 2 years of elevated prices, 2 years of the American economy adjusting to a world where 20% of global oil production has been reduced, disrupted, or permanently impaired by 6 weeks of fighting in a waterway most Americans never think about. 34,000 shipping routes have been diverted globally, and the rerouting costs are being passed directly to American consumers. More than 34,000 shipping routes have been diverted globally as a result of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, according to supply chain analysis. Ships that normally transit the strait and proceed through the Suez Canal to European and American ports are being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That detour adds approximately 10 to 15 days to transit times, and every additional day at sea is an additional day of fuel consumption, crew costs, insurance costs, and opportunity costs for the vessel. Freight costs for Middle East routes have more than doubled since the crisis began. And for American importers, the crisis adds a significant new cost layer on top of existing tariffs. Higher shipping rates, longer transit times, soaring energy and raw material prices, and elevated war risk insurance premiums are all hitting simultaneously. Aluminum prices are up, sulfur prices are up, graphite prices are up, methanol, which is used in chemical manufacturing and plastics production, has been disrupted because 1/3 of global seaborne methanol trade passes through the strait. The plastics, chemicals, and materials that American manufacturers use as inputs in thousands of consumer products are all more expensive because the shipping route that connected their source to their destination is blocked. And the American consumer who buys a product made with any of those materials is paying for the disruption even if they have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. The cost is in the price, hidden, undisclosed, but present in every product whose supply chain touched the Gulf at any point. And the rerouting is not just about energy. Major container shipping companies, including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended all transits through the strait. Every container ship carrying manufactured goods, consumer electronics, automotive parts, clothing, textiles, and household items from manufacturing centers in Asia to markets in Europe and the eastern United States that normally pass through the strait is now taking the long route around Africa. The delay and the cost are being absorbed by importers, distributors, and retailers who will pass every dollar of it to the consumer. The passage of time does not reduce these costs. It accumulates them. Every week that the strait remains disrupted adds another week of inflated shipping costs to the pipeline of goods moving toward American stores. And those inflated costs will continue to arrive at the retail shelf for months after the strait eventually reopens, because the goods that are currently in transit at the higher cost are the goods that will be on the shelf in June, July, August, and September. And every American business that imports raw materials, components, or finished goods from or through the Middle East is absorbing a cost increase right now that they did not budget for, did not anticipate, and cannot pass to the consumer without raising prices. The European Central Bank has warned that a prolonged conflict will likely trigger stagflation and push Germany and Italy into technical recession. Chemical and steel manufacturers across the EU and UK have imposed surcharges of up to 30% to offset surging electricity and feedstock costs. Those surcharges flow directly to American importers of European goods. American car manufacturers that source components from European suppliers who source energy from Gulf LNG that passes through the Strait of Hormuz are paying more for every vehicle they build. American pharmaceutical companies that source ingredients from chemical manufacturers in Germany and India are paying more for every medication they produce. American construction companies that use aluminum, steel, and petrochemical-based materials are paying more for every building they build, every road they pave, every bridge they repair. The 34,000 diverted shipping routes represent 34,000 individual cost increases that will appear as price increases on 34,000 different categories of goods over the next 3 to 9 months. And the consumer will see a higher price tag and wonder why. The answer is 21 miles wide, located between Iran and Oman, and currently has mines in it that nobody can find. Iran is simultaneously increasing its own oil exports while blocking everyone else and profiting from the crisis it created. While the Gulf states have been forced to shut in 12 million barrels per day of production because the strait is blocked, Iran has been increasing its own oil exports. Shipping data analyzed by multiple outlets shows that Iranian oil exports have surged to their highest levels in years during the crisis. Iran's oil production infrastructure is located on its own territory with access to export routes that do not require transiting the bottleneck it created. Iran can export through ports on the Gulf of Oman side, bypassing the choke point entirely. And global oil prices have risen approximately 40% during the war, from around $72 per barrel before the conflict to $118 at the peak and approximately $95 to $100 currently, which means Iran is selling more oil at a price that is 40% higher than before it closed the strait. Iran created an energy crisis. The energy crisis raised oil prices, and Iran is profiting from the elevated prices by exporting its own oil while preventing its neighbors from exporting theirs. The estimated daily loss to Iran from disrupted trade through the strait is approximately $435 million, according to crisis analysis. But that loss is being partially offset by the dramatically higher revenue Iran is earning on its own exports at the inflated price. And the countries that are losing the most, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, the UAE, are the countries whose oil production is trapped inside the Gulf. The geopolitical consequence is that Iran has weaponized the strait not just militarily but economically, creating a situation where the longer the crisis lasts, the more Iran benefits relative to its regional competitors. Iran International reported that Iran's own oil export revenues during the crisis have been sufficient to partially offset the economic damage from the war, and that this revenue dynamic reduces Iran's incentive to agree to terms that would fully reopen the strait without conditions. The toll system is not just a wartime improvisation. It is the prototype of a permanent revenue extraction mechanism that Iran is attempting to codify into law. And every dollar of that revenue comes from the global energy system, which means every dollar comes from the consumers who pay for the energy at the other end of the supply chain. American consumers, European consumers, Asian consumers, every family that pays an electricity bill, a gas bill, a heating bill, or a grocery bill is contributing to the revenue stream that Iran is using to fund the IRGC while simultaneously blocking its neighbors' access to the global market. The American family that paid $4.15 at the pump this week is not just paying for gasoline. They are paying for the geopolitical restructuring of the global energy system in real time, and nobody at the gas station told them. And here is the specific household math that every American family should do right now with a calculator and their most recent bills. Before the war, the average American household spent approximately $2,800 per year on gasoline at $3 per gallon. At the current average of $4.15 per gallon, that same household is spending approximately $3,875 per year. That is a $1 increase. 0.75 annual increase in gasoline costs alone. Natural gas prices for home heating and cooking have risen in tandem with global energy costs. The average American natural gas bill was approximately $75 per month before the crisis. It is now approximately $100 to $110 per month in many markets, an increase of $300 to $420 per year. Electricity rates, which are partially driven by natural gas-fired power generation, have risen to $165 per month on average from $121 before the broader energy inflation began, adding approximately $528 per year. The fertilizer-driven food price increase that will arrive in August through October will add an estimated 5 to 10% to the grocery bill, approximately $660 to $1,320 per year for a family of four. The shipping cost increases from 34,000 diverted routes will add 2 to 5% to the price of imported goods, approximately $400 to $1,000 per year, depending on the family's consumption of imported products. Add those figures together. Gasoline, $1,075, natural gas $360, electricity $528, food $990 at the midpoint, imported goods $700 at the midpoint. The total additional cost to the average American family from the Strait of Hormuz crisis is approximately $3,653 per year. That is $304 per month. $304 per month that the average American family did not have in their budget on February 27th and is now being extracted from their household finances by a chain of events that started with airstrikes they did not authorize and a strait closure they could not prevent. On the median household income of $80,000, an additional $3,653 per year represents 4.6% of gross income. After taxes, that same $3,653 represents approximately 6 to 7% of take-home pay. And for the 40% of American families who are already spending every dollar of income on necessities before the war, that additional $304 per month is not being absorbed by cutting discretionary spending. It is being absorbed by going deeper into credit card debt, by skipping medical appointments, by reducing food quality, by deferring car maintenance, by falling behind on bills, and by drawing down the last of whatever savings buffer they had left from the pandemic recovery. Bloomberg reported that Pakistan reached out to some of the world's biggest commodity traders to see if they had vessels that could transit Hormuz while temporarily sailing under a Pakistani flag, because Iran had agreed to allow 20 Pakistani vessels through. The global commodity trading industry is now negotiating with the IRGC for permission to move oil through a waterway that was supposed to be an international shipping lane. Ships are changing flags, paying in yuan and cryptocurrency, registering with a designated terrorist organization, and routing around Iranian islands under armed escort. This is not the global energy system that existed on February 27, 2026. This is a fundamentally different system. And the prices that the old system produced, the $70 oil, the $3 gasoline, the predictable natural gas prices, the stable fertilizer costs, the manageable shipping rates, those prices belong to a world that no longer exists. The new world has a toll booth in the strait, mines in the water, a naval blockade on top of the mines, a ceasefire that expires tomorrow with no replacement, and 230 loaded supertankers sitting idle with enough oil to power the American economy for weeks if only someone could get it out. That oil is not coming out tomorrow. It is not coming out next week. The EIA said that resuming flows through the Strait of Hormuz remains the single most important variable in easing the pressure on energy supplies, prices, and the global economy. And the single most important variable in the global economy is currently controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is charging $2 million per ship in Chinese yuan, has planted mines it cannot locate, and is asking its parliament to make the arrangement permanent. That is what Iran just did. That is the cost. And it is being charged to every American family every month on every bill for as long as the strait remains in the hands of the people who closed it. Share this video with every American family you know, because the price they are paying at the pump, at the grocery store, and on the utility bill is not an accident. It is the direct, traceable, documented cost of a geopolitical event that most Americans have never had explained to them in language they can understand. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the ceasefire expires tomorrow, and whatever happens next will change the price of everything again. And I will be here to tell you what it costs, because the connection between a toll booth operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in a 21-mile waterway between Iran and Oman, and the $4.15 you paid at the pump this morning, and the chicken breast that costs $3 more per pound than it did in January, and the electric bill that arrived $40 higher than last month is a connection that nobody on cable news is making in plain English. And the American family that does not understand that connection is the American family that will be blindsided by the next price increase, and the one after that, and the one after that, for as long as the strait remains closed, mined, tolled, blockaded, and fought over by military forces on both sides of a ceasefire that expires tomorrow with no replacement in sight.